Near Future by Jennie Moench, a collection of science fiction short stories published by Warrior Publications. Copyright 2018 by Jennie Moench. All rights reserved, including the right of reproduction in whole or in part in any form, audio or printed. Hello, I'm Jennie Moench. I'm the author of Near Future. It's a collection of short sci-fi stories. And in the second story, I just want to let you know that the background video is from Marvin's Marvelous Mechanical Museum in Michigan. And the story is called You're Only Old Once. And I did steal that title from a Dr. Seuss book of the same name. And it does take place in a nursing home. But the real story is about VR, virtual reality. And some of the negative things, but mostly positive. And I think you're going to find it entertaining. And again, if you are interested in the entire book, I can send you a free PDF file if you do send me a message. Thank you very much. You're Only Old Once. City Home was the oubliette of Flint nursing homes. It was where one ended up if they lived longer than their income and had no one else interested in their welfare. Most of the residents' rent was paid by the government. Most of their guardians were their social workers. There was such a large portion of the population in general that was infirm or in some way needed assistance that the government agencies had to be streamlined. At those facilities, human workers were overburdened. Things had become automated. City Home was the perfect place to try out all the new gizmos for lifting, cleaning, and entertaining the infirm. City Home was the cutting edge of technology, whether the unlucky residents were willing participants or not. "Okay, okay," Eddie chanted as he pushed his shoulder into a metal rod that he and Bill had extended on a makeshift way to hoist a sling that held a 400-pound resident back onto a rail that was carrying the naked man out of a bathing machine. Bill was holding the extender a bit farther down with both hands over his head, knees bent and feet braced firmly on the rubber runner that he was standing on. The disabled resident watched with interest as he swayed precariously over the drawing area. The heat lamp overhead was making everyone even more uncomfortable. Then, mercifully, they heard a click, and that confirmed that the rod was back into place. Everyone sighed with relief, especially the wide-eyed resident. "You know, Eddie," Bill began as he was walking to the control panel to press the reset button that immediately restarted the man in the sling his ride through the drawing area and into the unloading bay. "I think this extender that we made is pretty handy. Now, all we need is a kind of jack that we could position under it wherever the resident falls off the rail again." Eddie nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, something that's tall enough to fit right up here," he said as he stood near the overhead rail. They discussed their plans until the resident began making uncomfortable noises that got their attention. Eddie held the man's oversized wheelchair as Bill pressed a button that gently glided the man's legs into the divided sides of a chute. He made a squealing sound as he slid into a disposable diaper, then into a wheelchair. Eddie tossed a hospital gown on the man's lap and then pushed him out of the double doors. He shouted for an aide and then left the man in the hallway. His bedside manners needed some polishing, but he was preoccupied with the idea that he had for the jack. He and Bill had never imagined that they would be working in a nursing home, since their field of expertise was mechanical engineering. But there they were. Peter Pepperdine, the building supervisor, noticed the nearly naked man in the hall as he was giving a tour to a new resident. He took hold of the wheelchair and continued walking at a brisk pace while wheeling the man into a nearby community room. He called for an aide and then returned to his conversation with a large, scruffy, middle-aged man. "Sorry about that," he started. "As you can see, some of our residents need more help than others. But what you will find out is that many of our residents are about your age. We have a variety of people living here. I'm sure that you'll make friends easily, Mr. Barry." Pete felt that addressing residents by their formal names promoted a sense of self-respect. Mr. Barry half listened. He was wanting to know which room was his. He slogged along in his baggy sweatpants and well-worn slippers. An ancient shirt almost covered his belly. "And here we have a community cafeteria." Peter stopped and made a sweeping motion with his arms to encourage the man to step inside. But the man merely grunted, sidestepped the room. Pete frowned. But undeterred, he continued down the hall. "And here," Peter made another grand gesture towards a block of windows, "the latest in virtual reality." This caused the man to stop. He examined the set of 5 rooms, each a small cubicle, empty except for a semi-automated, goggle-wearing resident lost in their personal virtual world. Some were in wheelchairs, others stood stooped in the center of their assigned rooms, mimicking some imaginary task. Mr. Barry squinted into the cameras that hung in each corner of the room. "What models are those?" "VR 5000, Pete chirped, happy to at last find the new resident's point of interest. "What apps are you running?" "Hundreds, but by far the most popular is Google History. This program was created by taking advantage of the mapping programs. One of the most popular features of this program was that you could upload the area of your choice in the time period of your choice. You might choose a city as it looked 50 years ago, so the residents visited and then lingered as ghosts on the streets. For a small monthly fee, you could again take up residence in your childhood home, customizing the interior as best you could remember. Some of the residents that had recently met in the home were now visiting one another in the ballparks and in the YMCA swimming pool. Wherever they dreamed, some even learned to fly above the buildings. When a new app became available that allowed you to use a horse-drawn carriage, some of them opted to ride down their city streets while sitting in the back of the wagon. Nighttime rides were the most fun. Some of the avatars wore animal suits, so the stuffed bunnies and kitty cats caroused together in the brightly lit city streets. Such fun. "Okay, so which one is my room?" Mr. Barry said impatiently. Peter Pepperdine guided the man down another hallway and around the corner. "Why, so far from the cafeteria," the man complained as he entered his new home. It was small, just a double bed and built-in cupboards. There was a pile of Mr. Barry's things on top of the bed. "Good. At least my stuff is here." He looked around at Pete. "Thanks." He waved the man off. Peter turned and left before he could answer Mr. Barry's last question. "Whatever," he thought to himself as he exited. Mr. Barry rifled through the boxes and bags, looking for his equipment. When he found the box he wanted, he pushed everything else onto the floor. He set an old computer onto a built-in counter that separated his built-in closets from his built-in drawers, and then he pushed the chair that was under the makeshift desk from the far corner of the room and began installing the cameras. Setting up the gaming equipment had been the most important thing to him. Even as he grieved over having to leave his childhood home, the place where he had spent his whole life with his mother. Now she was dead, and he had no income. He couldn't keep up with the taxes with government aid, so here he was, the place you go when you're all alone and don't know how to take care of yourself. But all that didn't matter as long as he had his gaming equipment. A few doors down was the gym. It was a big room with padded floors and exercise equipment on the sides of the large open space with mirrored walls at the other end. An aerobics class was currently underway. A medium-sized, middle-aged woman in leotards was leading a class in a slow kind of dance. There were about 6 women and a couple of men in attendance. They mimicked their instructor as best they could. Most were regulars and had an easy time keeping up, but a few, like Mrs. White, were lagging behind. The lady next to her asked if she wanted her wheelchair. Miss White agreed. She stood with sloped shoulders and a defeated look as Miss Baker retrieved a tattered chair. As Miss Baker held the hands on the back of the chair, Miss White took a seat. "Brakes don't work," she explained as Mrs. Baker failed in getting them to engage. The class shortly concluded. "Why don't you get a new chair?" Miss Baker whispered to Miss White. "I'm saving up, but if I use too much of my benefits, then I can't afford my rent," she explained. Miss Baker understood. Miss White had taken a VR property from the happiest time in her life, and it had a 3-acre yard with an immaculate lawn and garden. It was beautiful. Miss Baker would often come over to visit. In VR, Miss White had loads of energy. They would ride bikes together. Sometimes Miss White would accompany Miss Baker on a wooded nature trail that she loved. Recently, Miss Baker had acquired a camera with VR credits that she had accumulated by winning at darts. She had a good arm, and those competitors were the reason why she was so vigilant about keeping up her aerobics classes and strength training. The camera allowed her to make videos that she posted. They were nature documentaries of the best online parks. Often she would take her dog Ruffles with her. It was her passion. That and the dart competitions. The two women went directly to the cafeteria. It was nearly dinner time, and their 2-hour time slots weren't until 7 p.m. Miss Baker retrieved them both a cup of coffee as they sat together waiting for their meal tray. It was shortly after they had settled in that they began a conversation when Bill and Eddie appeared in the cafeteria doors. They stood just inside, scanning the crowd of gray heads. Finally, Bill spoke up. "There he is." The duo then moved towards the large man that they had bathed earlier, and Abe joined them. We need to give this one a bath," Eddie announced, pointing down at the man. He looked up with an alarmed look on his face, then at the aide, shaking his head emphatically. She looked back at Eddie. "No, you just bathed him earlier today." She then looked at a small tablet that she had pulled out of her pocket. "But you can bathe Miss Kelly," she said, pointing at a wheelchair-bound lady nearby. The pair looked at Miss Kelly. "Now, this one is our test data," Eddie explained, pointing down at the large man. Mr. Norris was afflicted with a kind of dementia that caused him to be mute and lose his short-term memory. But somehow the engineers had imprinted on that primal part of his brain. He was wide-eyed and shaking his head violently. The nurse noted his behavior while Bill was inspecting Miss Kelly. "I don't know," he mused as Miss Kelly began to object. "I don't want anything to do with that bathing house of horrors of yours," she snarled. Unperturbed, Bill placed his hands under her arms from behind to get a weight estimate. Miss Kelly began shouting out a long string of profanities. "I don't know," he muttered again. Then to the aide, "Do you have a different one this size or bigger but less vocal?" Mr. Barry's new bed lacked the lumps and bumps that he was accustomed to, and the game he was playing seemed to lag more than usual. But when he removed the screen in front of him, it was comforting to see all of his familiar things around him, and well worth the bulkiness of playing a video game within VR. Light shined from the window beside him. His Superman curtains were pulled back. Everything was so quiet. Then his mother came to the door, knocked once, and announced, "Time for dinner, Leonard." He kind of wished that she had opened the door and showed herself. His fingers moved over the button that would summon her back to his room. But then he hesitated and decided to inventory his things instead. There was a stack of old comic books that he had inherited from his dad on top of a chest of drawers. The Archies were on top. Next to them were action figures. Superman, Spider-Man, Batman with Robin, all the greats. Littering the floor was an assortment of weapons, everything from medieval swords and bowls to futuristic ray guns and an assault rifle. He slid off his bed and walked over to the window. The sun was beginning to shine. It was late afternoon. There was a nature trail that crossed the prairie behind his house. It took nature lovers to one forested area to another. Occasionally he had noticed people walking. He had used them as target practice in the past. But then the VR police made a visit and gave him a warning. "Stupid whiners," he thought, still angry about the incident. But this time, the traveler was a beautiful woman with long, bright cherry red hair poking out from under a knitted cap. She was walking with a small brown cocker spaniel. He mused. He watched her walk gingerly as she played with a dog and continued past his house, then disappeared in the tree line. He wondered what she did in there. He hadn't explored the forest. In the real world, he had only been there once. It was when his cousins had come for a visit. But when they moved away, he had no one to play with, so the outside visits had ended. Now he visited it in VR, just for something to do. But his stomach was rumbling. Time for dinner. Millie pointed her camera towards a bird nest that she had been observing regularly. She was recording the small family of sparrows. First the building of the nest, then the laying of the eggs, and now the dedicated parents keeping watch over their future baby birds. It was delightful. Her yearly VR park fee was well worth it. These little movies that she had been working on were her passion. She posted them on her online profile and had acquired several dedicated followers. Satisfied, she pulled down a menu that pointed to an address of her friend Debbie. Her avatar disappeared and reappeared at the front door of her friend, along with the VR dog Ruffles. The home was beautiful. It was where Debbie had lived as the wife of an affluent lawyer. one from a long line of lawyers. Their marriage hadn't been a popular match, with her being so much older than her husband, but at the time she was a well-known socialite in the small city. Her marriage was happy until her new husband changed his mind about having children that she could no longer bear. The divorce had left her penniless. Millie opened the door as the butler announced her arrival. "Deborah is in the backyard," he told Millie dryly. Millie moved through the neatly furnished home, then into the kitchen with Ruffles in tow. They opened a sliding glass door off the kitchen and found Debbie in the backyard rearranging flower beds of beautiful red roses, preparing for a garden party next week. Her lawn was the most lovely shade of green. Light filtered through the oak trees near the house, making a fairy tale-like shadow on the lawn. It was getting close to dusk. The VR world did a good imitation. She sat down in a chair that had a convenient counterpart in the real world. Millie could tell by its gold color. It was nice to get off her feet. She played with Ruffles and looked around herself. There was a bird feeder a few feet away, where the cardinals and the blue jays were taking turns eating seeds. VR critters were so much more polite than real ones. "This is all so lovely," Millie began. Debbie paused in her task to take in the loveliness for herself. She sighed. "It's worth every penny." Millie used this as an opening. "You know, Debbie," she continued. She had been giving her friend's money troubles much thought. "I really like it here. In fact, I was wondering if you might consider letting me use one of your extra bedrooms. Then we could split the rent." Debbie turned to her friend. "Yes, that would be wonderful." Millie stood up and clapped her hands. "Good. I'd love to be able to plant some milkweed along the edge of the property." She pointed towards the back. Debbie looked on, but with less enthusiasm. "For the butterflies," Millie added. "Oh, butterflies would be nice," Debbie offered reluctantly. "And Debbie," Millie added enthusiastically, "now you could afford the park fee. You could go walking with Ruffles and I." Debbie was still contemplating the milkweed. Oh yeah, sure." Mr. Barry was lost. He was looking for the cafeteria, but the labyrinth of hallways had him confused. Finally, he heard some loud talking and thought there must be a competent person to direct him. When he rounded the corner, he saw Bill and Eddie, sopping wet, with an equally drenched lady in a wheelchair that was holding a large white towel as a blanket as she was complaining bitterly. Bill was calling for assistance. "Housekeeping! We need housekeeping and an aide, please!" Then he saw a sign on the opposite wall with an arrow under the word cafeteria. He ignored the threesome and followed the arrow, directing him away from the commotion. He wasn't used to people. He did what he could to avoid them. The cafeteria was nearly empty. He walked up to a lady behind the counter. She asked for his name and looked up his name on the computer, then asked for his preferences. He didn't expect to like what they gave him. No one cooked like his mother. If he couldn't have one of her dinners, he would have preferred fast food. But it didn't look like he was going to get either. He took his tray and he shuffled over to an empty table on a less occupied room. Soon an elderly man walked up. Mr. Barry ignored him until the man spoke. "Hey, are you the new guy?" "Yeah," he answered, glancing up at the man, but only momentarily. "Say, aren't you kind of young to be here with all this old folks?" the gray man offered. Mr. Barry didn't know how to answer these kinds of questions when people made remarks in the form of a question, so he just kept his eyes on his plate and continued eating. "The meatloaf is better," the man said after a long pause. Mr. Barry continued to ignore him until he walked away. He wasn't interested in making friends. He didn't want anything to do with any of these people in this new residence. He didn't even like the way they smelled, even though his smell was a less popular scent. He just really didn't want to be there. And as soon as he finished dinner, he'd go back to his room and disappear. A few minutes later, that's just what he did. He disappeared into his room and then disappeared into his room. He could breathe here, sitting with his back against the gold headboard, his mother's voice calling from the other side of the door. "It's 8 o'clock, Leonard. Time to get ready for bed." Leonard paused. Hearing her voice made him want to open the door to let her into the room. But then he reconsidered and sat back against the headboard once again. He missed her. She had taken good care of him all his life, but for some reason he had lost sight of that. Rather than loving and respecting her, he grew contemptuous. She was the reason that he had no job, no friends, no education, no ambition. It was all her fault. First with rudeness, then willful behaviors. Then as he grew, his disrespect became cruelty. He didn't pay attention to her changes in behavior, how she began to limp, to hold her side. He didn't notice right up until the day she failed to wake him up in the morning, forgot to make his breakfast, and there she was, dead, still laying in her bed. He pondered the idea of visiting his favorite chat room. It was an old building in Berlin where a group of neo-Nazis hung out. This used to be his favorite place to go until his mother bought him the DNA test for his birthday a few years ago. Now his chats with the white supremacy group seemed a bit futile. But he still enjoyed the banter. Besides, no one really knew anything about one another anymore anyway. Then he tried to empty his mind, relax, and consider his surroundings. That was when he noticed movement through the window across the room from himself. He used his controller to get closer. It was that same red-haired girl and her dog. She was looking around herself as she walked, with the little cocker spaniel running in circles around her, giving an occasional bark. Leonard wondered what the attraction was. What did she do when she reached the other side of the park? He used his controller to gain access to the back of his yard. He watched her until she was out of sight. He stood staring at the place where she had vanished. He heard one last bark. He mused aloud. He remembered that he still had a few dollars in his account, more than necessary to buy an access to the park for a year. He had been getting a little bored with his usual routine. He decided that it was time to go for a walk in the woods. So after making the necessary transaction, he used his controller to cross the property line and venture down the park trail. He stood for a moment and looked around himself as he observed the red-haired girl do. But he didn't understand the attraction. What had she been looking at, he wondered. Evening was coming, causing a dimming effect, but there were still birds and butterflies and even something that could have been a bat, but so what, he said to himself. He used his controller to zoom to the opposite end of the prairie and bring himself to the edge of the forest. When he entered, he noticed the noise of the crickets, and the lighting had changed to him. The pockets of light and dark were disorienting. He zoomed farther down the trail. He finally spotted her. She was looking through binoculars that were pointed up a tree. He moved beside her. "Hello," he said in his friendliest voice. She put down her binoculars and looked at the boy beside her. "Hello," she answered. "Were you interested in looking at a bird's nest?" He wasn't, but he wanted to start out on her good side. "Sure." She handed him the binoculars. "It's getting dark, but you can still see the mom and the dad. They are taking turns sitting on the eggs. Can you see them?" Leonard located them with Millie's direction. "Yeah, cool." He tried to put a little enthusiasm into his voice as he handed her back the binoculars. "So what do you do in here anyway?" he asked. "Well, I enjoy the walks, but I also make nature videos." "Oh, so you're a videographer?" "Not really," Millie started. "Actually, I'm an artist." "So you draw pictures? Are you famous?" Millie laughed. "No, I sell a few things here and there, but I really just consider myself the creative type, so my medium is whatever is in my hands. Today it's a pair of binoculars and my camera. I'm planning to find a quiet place, wait for dark, and see what kind of nocturnal animals I come across." Leonard didn't understand how any of that could be fun. "Why?" "I'm going to make a video. I post them and let everyone know how great it is here." "This is pretty boring. Want to go play a game? Do something new?" Millie sighed. "How could you not like nature? Everyone loves nature. It's a primal thing. It's universal." "I don't. It's boring." "Well, then you must be anemic, nature deficient. You need several doses of nature, then you'll get better." "If you like it so much, why don't you go there for real?" Millie paused. "The reason I come here, even though nature in the real world is better, is because my body is stranded in the real world. so I have to make the best of this VR version. There was an awkward pause. Millie didn't mean for the conversation to get glum. So, what was your name? I'm Millie. Leonard. He was considering what she said. He wondered if she was some kind of an invalid. The idea made her less attractive. But for some reason, he was enjoying the conversation. But why do you think everyone should enjoy nature? Lots of people like to do new stuff. Millie shook her head. There's nothing new. What? Leonard began to protest. What I mean is that, Millie motioned around herself, this is the same thing that people have been doing forever. Me walking my dog Ruffles in the woods, people were doing this, enjoying this 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago. We are still doing what we've always done. There is no new. We still enjoy the same pleasures. We have always been interested in other views of existence, other cultures of altered states of existence, and the new view of reality that we have from there. VR is just that, but not as good as the real world that it's mimicking. I'd take VR over the real world any day. You can do anything in VR. Want me to show you a cool place? New Orleans. Millie was becoming suspicious that her young friend might not be so young. Where do you go in New Orleans? Bourbon Street. It's always Mardi Gras at sunset there. How old are you? She asked. 9. How old are you in the real world? 9. I'm always 9, he insisted. Millie shook her head. I don't think so. Leonard was becoming agitated. What the hell do you care? You're probably some old invalid in a wheelchair. Millie wanted to walk away. She just somehow felt sorry for him. I am old. I live in a nursing home. But I still enjoy life. Do you? Leonard looked stymied, but finally answered. I like being in VR. That's where my home is now. Don't you ever enjoy going to places and doing things in the real life? Can you? Leonard didn't like where the conversation was going, yet he felt compelled to continue. I don't have anyone anymore, not in the real world. Millie felt sorry for him. That's sad. Sometimes I feel sad too, being so old. But you know, I have to believe that maybe when something is old and gets used up, one day it is recycled and becomes new again. After that, who knows if we have any say in where we end up. If we do, well then, maybe being here was our choice to begin with. She knelt down in front of Leonard. Maybe we just need to learn to be happy where we are. Leonard was feeling emotions that he usually avoided, and it wasn't pleasant for him. Then maybe I should just kill myself and see where I'm recycled to. Can't be any worse than here. He pulled down a menu and disappeared back into his room, leaving Millie worried that she had done something wrong. When he arrived back in his room, he was still upset. He looked around at his familiar things, but for some reason everything just looked like pictures, as though he was inside of an animation, which he was. He decided that he wanted to know more about Millie. He pulled down a menu and searched the name of the park where he had been, and there they were, Millie's nature films. He opened one. Instantly he could see the tree that they had been standing next to. Then he zoomed in on the nest. She was explaining the kind of bird that was being filmed and its habits. Leonard wasn't interested in the bird, but there was something about her voice that comforted him. He went to her profile. There was a split screen with her avatar next to it and a recent photo of her. Leonard studied the picture. She looked to be about 70. Her dark gray hair was pulled back, but her face was kind and thoughtful. Her address was blank. He wondered which nursing home she lived in. Chances were that it was nearby. Otherwise, why would she be at that park? It wasn't a big tourist attraction or anything. He went back to the videos. He watched every one of them. He wondered if Millie was still at the park. Curious, he zoomed back to the entrance of the wooded area where he had seen her last. He moved cautiously, always looking ahead of his avatar. He regained the area near the bird's nest. She was gone. He was disappointed, and the noise of the crickets bothered him. Still, he wanted to see what the bird eggs looked like. He pulled down a menu and grabbed a jetpack. He zoomed up to the bird nest level. There were 3 eggs, small and blue in color. The parent birds were flying at him and squawking. He swatted at them, but they persisted. So he pulled out a gun from his toolbox and shot both of them. This was fun, he decided. What about the eggs? He tossed them one at a time into the air and shot them, missing all three, but managed to break them as they fell to the ground. He put down his jetpack and then had the idea of pulling a saw out of his toolbox and cutting the tree down. It was a thick tree, and it took quite a while for him with a noisy chainsaw to rip through it. But eventually the tree fell at an angle across the trail. This inspired the little madman. With glee, he moved from tree to tree, cutting them all down until the forest was decimated. Animals, squirrels, and other animals noisily scampered from the scene of devastation. He worked well into the night. The next morning, Miss White and Miss Baker had early VR appointments since Miss Baker was scheduled to be in a dart contest and Miss White wanted to be there to cheer her on. She easily took on and beat everyone in her age group, putting her in the championship rounds and winning her 100 credits. But now she was competing with people much younger than her. She ended up losing to a 20-something man, but she had held her own and walked away proudly with her winnings. The two women were in high spirits. "Debbie," Millie gushed, "let's pay your first-year park fee right now, and then I can show you the bird nest that I've been filming. You're going to love that park." Debbie agreed, and shortly the two were standing at the entrance of the park. Millie took her down the first set of wooded trails, pointing out the wildlife and identifying bird calls. "Doesn't it make you want to thank the creators?" Millie mused. But when they started across the prairie, Millie could see that something on the other side was wrong. The tree line in the distance was lower. The trees in front had been reduced to piles. The two women zoomed closer. Millie was crestfallen. The trails were covered over with raised trees, and worse yet, the tree was littered with an assortment of murdered animals. Millie immediately recalled the conversation the day before with Leonard. She had told Debbie about it, so when Millie uttered Leonard aloud, Millie knew what she was referring to. But what they didn't know was that he was listening from behind a fallen tree nearby. "Do you really think that one little boy could do this?" Debbie asked. "No, not a little boy. That avatar belongs to a grown man. I'm sure of it," Millie fumed. "A destructive, sick man." "What do you know, you old hag?" came a retort from Leonard as he jumped out in front of the women. They both were startled by his sudden appearance. "Are you saying that you didn't do this?" Millie asked him, after recovering herself. "I did it. So what? It's just junk. It's pretend. But I wish it were real so that I could hear the animals scream when I killed them." "You nasty little man," Millie shouted with venom. The conversation deteriorated more as Leonard let out a string of profanities. The woman threatened him with the police. Then Debbie pulled down a menu and encouraged Millie to do the same, so that they both disappeared back to their shared home, but not before Leonard was able to copy the link. "What should we do?" Debbie asked her friend. The two of them were still shaken from the ordeal. They sat down in their golden chairs. If they had known that Leonard had their home address, they would have been even more worried. "I know," Millie began. "We need to tell the VR police. This was an organization that worked for the creator of the site. They handled code and user problems. Their offices were located in the police stations." Millie looked up a link, and then the two women disappeared to reappear at their local police station. They found themselves in a waiting room. A male avatar sat at a desk in front of them. "Can I help you?" "Yes, please." The two women moved closer to the desk. "We want to report a vandal in City Park. He destroyed all the trees and wildlife in the back of the park." "Do you know his IP address?" the policeman asked as he viewed the damage. "No, just that his name is Leonard. He uses a 9-year-old avatar, but I'm sure he's an adult. You wouldn't believe his language." "Okay, I can fix the damage by uploading the last backup of the park from the 1st of the month. But unless you have an address for this guy, I can't put him on notice. The best I can do is send a message to all the people with park passes reminding them that they are not allowed to destroy the park, or they'll lose their park pass. Millie looked at the man in disbelief. But he might do it again. And what about the bird's nest and the eggs that were about to hatch? Oogle history has hard coding for day and night effects, and also for animal gestation. So, if your bird eggs were scheduled to hatch by now, they will appear hatched. Otherwise, the nest should look as it did before it was destroyed. Millie was grateful for the news, but something about the officer's explanation seemed kind of calloused. It was unsettling to her for some reason. But still a bit dazed, the women left. Returning to Debbie's backyard, they relaxed under an oak tree, admiring the new row of red roses and discussing Debbie's plans for the garden party later that week. Little did they know that they were being overheard. A clock appeared, which was what happened when their turn was close to an end. Millie left to check on her eggs at the park. It was a comfort to see everything as it should be. The eggs still unhatched in their nest. The parent birds were taking turns sitting on the eggs. She was happy about that. She was hoping to witness the little chicks emerging from the eggs, or at least shortly afterward. Leonard was back in his room, sitting on his golden bed doing some research. The house he had followed the two women to was formerly owned by a couple by the last name of White. Daniel and Deborah White. He checked Millie's profile and found that Debbie and Millie were friends. Now to check Debbie White to see if she had an address listed on her profile. Yes, there it was. Leonard was amazed to find that Debbie now resided at City Home. Huh, he muttered aloud. It was nearly noon. Leonard decided that he was hungry and wanted to stake out the cafeteria where the two women were bound to turn up. He took off his goggles and slid off the side of his not-so-shiny bed. His body was stiff from sitting so long, but luckily he was still wearing his slippers from the breakfast excursion, so he shuffled down the hall towards the cafeteria. There was shouting and a chorus of old voices shouting, "Rat! Rat!" as he passed one of the many community rooms. There were a half a dozen or more aged people sporting wheelchairs and walkers, shouting for help and getting all jumbled up as they scrambled out of the room. He was mildly curious about what had happened to cause such a ruckus, but not my problem, he thought to himself as he ignored their pleas and walked past. Once in the cafeteria, he took his tray of food to a table near the entrance. Looking around the room, it appeared that the women hadn't arrived yet. He ate slowly, keeping an eye open on the doorway. The features of the room were pretty bland. White walls, white tile floor, round white tables, and folding chairs. No expense spared on this place, he thought to himself. Then another ruckus could be heard just outside the doorway to the cafeteria. It was a nurse shouting at the two engineers. "I told you to program that thing to only clean the floors at night when the residents were in bed," she shouted mercilessly at the two men. "It wasn't supposed to happen," came Eddie's retort. "Maybe the code was accidentally changed from PM to AM. I don't know." "Noon is PM, you moron," she shouted back. "And whose idea was it to make it look like a rat?" "A mouse, a cute little mouse. We thought they'd like it," Eddie returned. Leonard continued to listen to the conversation until his attention was diverted by the two women he was looking for. They looked just as they had in their photos, except Debbie was in a wheelchair and Millie was pushing it, her long gray braid reaching her waist in the back. He kept an eye on them as they settled in a table across the room from him. Millie pushed Debbie's chair up to the table, then went to the lunch counter. He examined Debbie. She was about a medium size or smaller, with short gray hair that was carefully groomed. Her wheelchair was old and ragged, and she was wearing what probably was at one time a neat pantsuit. Now it was well worn. The flowery blouse underneath the jacket was faded. Millie came back to the table carrying a tray with two small plates of salad and drinks. She arranged the table as though she were Debbie's servant, Leonard thought to himself. The truth was, years ago, when Debbie was a socialite and Millie was a starving artist, they had known one another from the galleries. Debbie had bought a few of Millie's paintings, but it wasn't until Millie moved to the city home that she identified a much more demure Deborah White as one of the wheelchair-bound residents. At first, Debbie was embarrassed and kept to herself, but gradually Millie won her over with a friendship that failed to acknowledge or even notice her fallen status. How pathetic, Leonard wanted to say aloud, but the truth was he secretly envied their friendship. His only friends were animated. He grew more jealous and angry as he watched them. His glare finally got Millie's attention. She looked over at him as if to ask him what he wanted, but Leonard just pushed his chair out, got up, and left the cafeteria. He shuffled back to his room. He'd show them, he thought to himself, as though they were the ones antagonizing him. Wrathful and filled with misguided sense of vengeance, he visited Debbie and Millie's house. He appeared at the front door. The butler opened it and announced that Deborah was currently unavailable. "That's okay," Leonard said as he pushed himself inside. He looked around with glee as he opened the menu and pulled a chainsaw out of the toolbox. That evening, when the two women re-entered the VR room for their regular appointment, it wasn't long before Millie's nature walk was interrupted by a frantic Debbie avatar. "Millie, he's ruined the house!" she cried frantically. Millie gasped. Then the two of them returned to their home. It was in shambles. The furniture was in pieces. The walls were scarred as though raked by fingernails of a giant. The paintings and photos that remained on the walls were defaced, and the lawn was bulldozed. Debbie's roses were pulled out and scattered in the dirt. Millie couldn't bear her friend sobbing. "Don't worry, I'll help you fix everything." "But the garden party is tomorrow," Debbie's voice cracked. Millie knew how important the party was for her friend. She had contacted old acquaintances that had retired to Florida and Arizona, people who she was unable to visit in person and that she would be too embarrassed to have visit her in the real world. Millie was the one who had thought of the party. She wanted Debbie to feel new pride and show her old friends that she was doing okay for herself, even if it was only in the VR world. "I know," Millie had an idea. "Let's go back to the VR police. Maybe they can restore it." This stopped Debbie's sobs. She readily agreed. Soon the two of them were in front of the familiar avatar. "He found out where we live and destroyed the house," the two women declared to the stone-faced officer. "Can you restore it?" The technician remembered the two women. "Sorry, but I can only restore a rented property to the condition it was before it was rented. You'd have to replace everything, walls, doors, windows. You'd have a blank slate again." Debbie's avatar was frantically shaking her head no. "That was the hardest part, the walls and everything. I had to hire someone to help. It was expensive." She looked at her friend. "What are we going to do? He might come back." "How can we keep him out?" Millie asked. "Well, let's look at your guest book," the technician offered. Neither of the women knew about the guest book, so he showed them where it was nested in their menus. It was a log of everyone who entered the residence. Most of the names were Debbie's and Millie's, but near the end was a blurred-out entry, encrypted. "He's using an illegal encryption program," the technician mused. "What does that mean?" Debbie asked. "Well, it means that he's hiding his identity." Debbie began sobbing again quietly. The man behind the avatar couldn't help but be touched. Her voice sounded like his grandmother. It made him decide to go above and beyond his job requirements and find out who was terrorizing the old woman. "It might take me a while, but I'll try to find a way to decipher the encryption. Then we can find out if this guy has any other reprimands. If he does, I do my best to have him barred from the program." The determined sound in the man's voice was comforting, but the two women were heavy-hearted as they returned to their ruined home. They spent their 2-hour appointment trying to recreate the backyard and the rooms downstairs, leaving the repaired walls without paintings or photos. Millie spent most of her credits replacing the furniture. They left reluctantly, worried that their work might have been in vain. The next day, an hour before the party, they were relieved to find everything in order as they had left it the day before. To Debbie's delight, the yard looked beautiful. "You know, I think we should just not worry about upstairs. If anyone asks for a tour, we'll just tell them that it's being remodeled," Debbie decided from her golden chair. Her avatar was dressed in a smart white pantsuit. She was wearing a white gardenia in her curly gray hair. She was much more relaxed than the day before. She had accepted that she couldn't correct the little devil, and she was only hoping that he wouldn't show up during the party. They were expecting a couple dozen guests, and had set up a large screen in the backyard so that they might have some of Millie's nature documentaries running in the background before showing the famous ancient movie A Streetcar Named Desire at sundown. There was a poker app set inside the house for anyone who might like to play. Millie had downloaded some of her artwork for the walls. Everything was ready as the guests started to show up. Debbie was delighted to have the opportunity to have her old friends over. Most she hadn't conversed with in years. The backyard filled up with chairs. Some of the guests arrived with them, golden wheelchairs. But the avatars were youthful and smartly dressed. Only their voices betrayed them. Millie knew many of them from the gallery days. It was fun to catch up. Everything was going wonderfully until sundown. It started with a laser blast that knocked Ruffles over dead. Millie screamed. Then a small explosion blew up the outdoor movie screen. Debbie just sat down hard on her wheelchair with her head in her hands. She was too distraught to even begin to deal with the problem. She just sat helpless with her chair, and everyone around her scrambling to figure out what was going on. Leonard jumped out from the side of the house with a can of red paint and began chasing the guests with it. He zoomed into the slumped-over Debbie and started shouting obscenities and calling her a pathetic old hag. He covered her with red paint. Then the chainsaw came out. Millie was trying to contain him with empty threats, but to no avail. Finally, as all the guests gathered around their humiliated hostess, one of them had the idea to visit their beach in Florida. So everyone disappeared to reappear there, leaving Leonard to wreak havoc on Debbie's house. What else could they do? It was a disaster, forced from their own home so that the vandal could have his way with it again. It was a grim ending to the party. The next morning, Debbie skipped her VR appointment, choosing to spend the day in bed. She didn't want to see the condition of the home. Millie, on the other hand, was determined to get the VR police to do something. The police station was her first stop. She was surprised when the officer greeted her as though she were expected. "So you got my message," she began. "No." "Well, I've been working overtime on this one, and I've been able to identify your vandal." Millie gasped. "Wonderful, now what?" "He does have priors. So he's been sent a notice that he is to vacate his rented house and be banned from Oogle history within 24 hours. Millie let out a delightful squeal. Also, the illegal encryption program was removed. Everywhere he's been now will show his VR address and ID in their logs. Then, in a lower voice, he added, "If you wanted to visit him, you might want to do that before midnight tonight." Millie was silent, considering her options. "Thank you," she added before disappearing. She threw off her goggles and headed to Debbie's real-life room. They had plans to make. Leonard had fallen asleep in his golden bed. It wasn't the first time. When he awoke, he stuffed his hand into a bag of chips that was nearby in his bed. He was thinking about the mess that he had made the night before. He decided to wait till the woman had cleaned it up again before reappearing. This was a fun game he had invented. He wondered if Millie was at the park yet. He had read a notice about defacing the park. Maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to do it again. Too risky. But Debbie's house was easy. The old women were stupid. He was clever. "Time to get up for school," his mother reminded him from the other side of the closed door. Leonard quit chewing for a moment. He looked at the door. His eyes lingered on the knob. Then he shook his memories from his mind, grabbed another handful of chips, and rested his head on the golden headboard. He was in the process of starting up his favorite game when his mother's voice was near the door again. "Leonard, your friends are here," she announced. He stopped. What friends? He wondered, but before he could consider the small number of possibilities, the two women appeared at the foot of his bed. "Hi, Leonard," their voices rang out in unison. Leonard was astonished to see them. He sputtered a few syllables of disbelief. The two women looked around the room, assessing the possibilities. "You know, somehow this room looks much like I expected," Millie mused. "What do you think, Debbie?" "Oh, I agree," she shrugged, pulling a comic book off the pile on his dresser. "Don't touch that," Leonard shouted, jumping off his bed to pull the book out of her hand. Millie kicked at a pile of weapons. "Hey!" he screamed, running to the other side of the room. But Millie's avatar was not in the least intimidated. Neither was Debbie's, as she pulled out her own can of red spray paint. She coated a pile of magazines and then continued to the wall, where she wrote, "Leonard's a loser." He became frantic. "Stop it, or I'll tear your house down," he threatened. "I don't think so," Millie mused as she used a machete to chop his game box. "You must not have read your messages this morning." Leonard stopped, considering how it was that they had found him. "You've been evicted," the two happy women chirped. "What?" "You have been banned from the program. Finished. You are out of here," Millie shouted gleefully. Leonard was in disbelief. He opened up his menu and checked the messages. There it was. He had been given 24 hours to vacate the program. No, I can't leave," he began rambling, but the women were too busy to pay attention. Millie was tossing his action figures up in the air and hitting them with a bat until she noticed a voice coming from the other side of the door. "Leonard, time for breakfast," it chirped. The two women stopped. "Who was that? Huh, Leonard? Was that your mom?" Debbie reached for the doorknob. "No!" Leonard shouted, throwing himself against the door and knocking over a real-life lamp in the process. It made a real-life crash onto the real-life floor. "Get out of here!" he screamed. The two women were startled by his reaction, but completely unperturbed. Avatars can't hurt avatars. So Millie pulled out a chainsaw. Leonard's pint-sized body started hopping up and down in unison with his real-life 300-pound version. It made for quite a ruckus. The noise, the screams, people in the halls were becoming concerned, especially when Leonard's real-life body went sprawling onto the floor. With much satisfaction, a vengeful Millie grasped the door handle. All she knew was that it was the thing that Leonard seemed to fear the most, whatever it was on the other side of the door. He was screaming and scooting himself on the floor, trying to pull himself up by the rails of his golden bed. He winced as he tried to stand, and his voice was shaking as he continued to threaten the women to get away from the door and out of his room. Millie joined her friend at the door. "Ooh, let's get a look at Leonard's mom. I bet she's a real winner." "Oh, she'd have to be with a son like Leonard," Debbie added over the angry cries. She pulled the door open. Both women looked into the opening. They both stood looking into a void with disappointment. It was empty white space, as though the world simply ended on the other side of the door. "Where's your mom, Leonard?" Debbie piped up, looking at the child as he struggled to get up. Leonard looked over at the open door, then stopped the struggle, letting his real-life body fall to the floor. "I didn't have a picture of her," he sobbed. The two women almost felt sorry for him. Then they watched his body raise and hover over his golden bed, then settle into it before disappearing. Both women sighed. "Guess our work here is finished," Debbie offered. They pulled down a menu and returned to the shambles of their home to straighten it out one last time. The work was interrupted by messages to Debbie from her friends, thanking her for the good time and inviting her to their online parties. This made the work lighter, entertaining even, as they began to laugh at the twisted sense of humor the creepy little kid had. Later, in the afternoon, the two women quit their labors and enjoyed quiet conversation from their golden thrones. Millie was showing Debbie how to do tricks with the resurrected ruffles. Life was interesting. Leonard had broken his leg in multiple places and twisted his wrist when he fell. He had also banged his head so hard that he had a concussion. But as soon as he was allowed out of bed, he was given an electric wheelchair on account of his hurt wrist. So he was on his way to the cafeteria to get whatever the fuck he wanted to eat. He still had a bandage around his head, which, with the long greasy hair sticking out of the back, gave him kind of a pirate look. But his broken leg, with its inflated cast, were tender. So the other pedestrians in the hall were getting angry looks and shouts of, "Get the fuck out of my way!" from him as he sped away too fast towards the cafeteria. He turned the final corner to get inside the room, and there they were, sitting at a table together, just like they always were. He hated them so much. If only his glare had lasers. His musings may have been what caused him not to have looked away soon enough to get Millie's attention, but it did. She nudged Debbie. "Look, there's that new guy. I heard he fell out of bed, but how did he hurt himself so bad?" "I don't know, Millie. They say he's one of those who lies in bed all day and eats pretend food. Makes your bones turn to mush." Yeah, Millie nodded. I think that's true.